The moment her hand hit my face, the entire first-class cabin went silent. I mean completely silent. The soft chatter stopped, the clinking glasses froze in midair, and even the hum of conversations from the row behind me seemed to disappear. I could feel the sting spreading across my cheek while the flight attendant stood over me, breathing hard like she had just done something heroic instead of something humiliating. Her voice came out sharp and loud enough for everyone around us to hear when she said, "I told you to get out of first class." My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I slowly lifted my head and looked directly into her eyes, and I could see it there, that certainty she had, that belief that she knew exactly who I was and where I belonged. The thing is, she had absolutely no idea. I took a slow breath and asked her one simple question. "Are you sure you want to do this?" She rolled her eyes like I was wasting her time and snapped back. "Either you move now, or I'll have security remove you." That's when I said the sentence that changed everything. I looked around the cabin, then back at her, and quietly said, "You might want to rethink that because I own this plane. And I want to know something before I tell you how this whole situation unfolded. Was I wrong for what happened next? Or would you have done the same thing if you were in my place? To understand how things escalated that far, you need to know who I am and how I ended up sitting in that seat in the first place. My name is Naomi Carter, and for most of my life, people have underestimated me before I even had the chance to introduce myself. I grew up in a small neighborhood where nobody expected much from anyone, especially not a young black girl with big dreams about aviation. When I was 10 years old, my father took me to an airport for the first time. We couldn't afford plane tickets or fancy trips, but he told me something that stuck with me forever. He said, "Some people watch planes take off, and some people decide they're going to build them." That moment changed the entire direction of my life. While other kids were talking about becoming singers or athletes, I became obsessed with airplanes. I spent hours reading about engines, aerodynamics, and airline companies. I knew the names of aircraft models the way other kids knew the names of cartoon characters. But dreams are one thing, and reality is another. When I told teachers I wanted to work in aviation, most of them smiled politely the way adults do when they assume you'll eventually grow out of your imagination. Some of them even told me directly that it was unrealistic. Aviation, they said, was complicated, expensive, and extremely competitive. What they didn't understand was that every time someone doubted me, it just added fuel to the fire inside me. By the time I graduated high school, I had already decided that I wasn't just going to work around airplanes. I was going to build something bigger. The journey wasn't easy. I worked multiple jobs while studying business and engineering. I spent nights barely sleeping, researching airline logistics, aircraft leasing, and aviation finance. I didn't have family connections or investors waiting to hand me millions of dollars. Everything I built came from persistence and an almost stubborn refusal to quit. After college, I started working for a small aviation leasing company. At first, I was just an assistant, organizing paperwork and scheduling meetings. But I paid attention to everything, every negotiation, every contract, every deal. I watched how airlines acquired planes, how routes were planned, how the entire industry operated behind the scenes. Years passed, and eventually, I started my own aircraft leasing company with two partners who believed in my vision. We started small, managing just a few planes leased to regional airlines. But over time, our company grew faster than anyone expected. By the time I turned 35, we had expanded into international partnerships and owned shares in multiple aircraft used by several airlines. The plane I was sitting on that day wasn't mine personally in the sense that my name was painted on the side, but my company owned the aircraft and leased it to the airline operating the flight. That meant, technically speaking, I did own the plane, but the flight attendant didn't know any of that when she walked up to me that afternoon. The day of the flight started normally enough. I had just finished a long week of meetings in Chicago and was heading to Los Angeles for a conference about sustainable aviation fuel. I arrived at the airport earlier than usual because I like to watch how airlines operate. It sounds strange, but when aviation is your life, even sitting at the gate watching ground crews prepare planes can be fascinating. The boarding process began smoothly. I scanned my first-class boarding pass, walked down the jet bridge, and greeted the crew as I stepped into the aircraft. The cabin smelled faintly like fresh coffee and leather seats. I found my seat near the front, placed my bag in the overhead compartment, and sat down while reviewing some notes on my tablet. Everything seemed perfectly normal for the first 15 minutes. Passengers were boarding, flight attendants were greeting people, and the usual light buzz filled the air. Then I noticed something odd. One of the attendants kept glancing at me, not casually, but repeatedly, like she was trying to figure something out. At first, I ignored it. People look at each other on planes all the time. But eventually, she walked down the aisle and stopped directly beside my seat. "Excuse me," she said in a tight voice. I looked up and smiled politely. "Yes." She crossed her arms and asked, "Can I see your boarding pass?" I thought it was strange since I had already scanned it at the gate, but I handed it to her without hesitation. She glanced at it quickly, frowned, and then looked back at me. "This says 2A, she said. "That's right," I replied calmly. She stared at me for a moment before speaking again. "Your seat is in economy." I blinked. "No, it's not. That's seat 2A. She shook her head like I was the one being difficult. "Ma'am, you must have misread your ticket." I pointed to the seat number above me. "That's literally seat 2A. Instead of acknowledging that, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Look, if you just go back to your assigned seat, we won't have to make this a problem." That was the first moment I felt the tension building in my chest. I said slowly, "This is my assigned seat." A couple sitting across the aisle started watching the exchange. I could feel the attention spreading across nearby rows. The attendant sighed loudly, clearly annoyed. "Ma'am, please stop arguing." I kept my tone calm. "I'm not arguing. I'm sitting in the seat on my ticket." Her expression hardened, and she suddenly raised her voice. "You need to move." I could feel the embarrassment creeping in, not because I had done anything wrong, but because situations like this always attract attention. Still, I stayed seated. Then she said something that made the entire situation crystal clear. She looked me up and down and said, "First class is reserved for passengers who actually paid for it." That sentence hung in the air like a bad smell. I slowly said, "I did pay for it." At that point, a man in the row behind me muttered, "Just show her the ticket again." I held up the boarding pass. But instead of examining it carefully, she scoffed and said, "People print fake boarding passes all the time." That's when the humiliation started turning into anger. I asked, "Are you accusing me of fraud?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she pointed toward the back of the plane and said, "Last warning, move." I felt my heartbeat getting faster. But I stayed calm and said, "No." That's when things escalated in a way I never expected. She suddenly grabbed my arm, trying to pull me out of the seat. Instinctively, I pulled away. And then, in a moment that felt almost surreal, she slapped me across the face. Gasps erupted around the cabin. My cheek burned, but the emotional shock was worse than the pain. For a few seconds, nobody moved. And that's the moment you heard about earlier, when I looked up at her and said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Because by that point, I already knew exactly how this situation was going to end. But before I tell you what happened next, let me pause for a second and ask you something. Imagine you're sitting on a plane, minding your own business, and suddenly a flight attendant humiliates you in front of everyone. accuses you of lying about your ticket, and then actually slaps you. What would you do in that moment? Would you stay calm? Would you defend yourself? Or would you demand consequences immediately? Because that was exactly the situation I was in, and I had to decide how to respond. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause for a second and comment below what you would have done if you were sitting in my seat. So there I was, sitting in first class with a burning cheek and an entire cabin staring at me. The attendant looked furious, but there was also a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes now that people were watching. I slowly stood up from my seat, not aggressively, just calmly, and I said something that made her freeze for a second. I'm going to ask you one more time to check that boarding pass carefully. She laughed nervously. You're done here. But I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, you should probably call your supervisor. One of the other flight attendants had already rushed down the aisle after hearing the commotion. She looked concerned and asked what was happening. Before I could speak, the first attendant said loudly, "Passenger refusing to leave first class." The second attendant looked at me and said gently, "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass?" I handed it to her. She read it carefully. Then she looked up at the seat number above me, then back at the ticket. Her eyebrows lifted. "You're in the correct seat," she said quietly. The first attendant snapped, "That's impossible." The second attendant handed the pass back to me and said, "She's right." And that's when I finally said the sentence that made the room go completely still. "I told you earlier you might want to rethink how you're handling this." I said calmly, "Because my company owns this aircraft." At first nobody reacted, then confusion spread across their faces. The second attendant blinked. "Excuse me." I opened my tablet and pulled up documentation from our company's leasing agreement. "This aircraft is leased to your airline by Carter Aviation Holdings," I said. Her eyes widened as she read the name. "My name," I continued calmly, "is Naomi Carter." The color drained from the first attendant's face. The rest of the story that followed was something none of them were prepared for. Because within 10 minutes, the captain himself walked out of the cockpit to speak with me. And what happened after that changed that airline's entire day. But the real twist came when the airline executives got involved. And let's just say the consequences for that flight attendant were something nobody in that cabin will ever forget. In the end, the situation wasn't just about one slap or one rude comment. It was about assumptions. It was about how quickly people decide who belongs and who doesn't. And it was about what happens when someone finally gets confronted with the reality of their own prejudice. If you are on my side in this story, make sure you like this video. If you enjoy hearing stories like this one, subscribe to the channel for more. And I really want to hear your thoughts on the whole situation. So go ahead and share your opinion in the comments section below. Was I right to handle things the way I did? Or should I have reacted differently? Either way, thank you for listening to my story, and I'll see you all in the next one.